Welcome to AP Biology. This is the first chapter, which I'm going to briefly go through some of the main points that the book discusses. Chapter 1 talks about defining life. Are the following items alive? You should be able to tell me why they are or are not alive. We've talked about the characteristics necessary to be considered living as freshmen. You have four following items: mushrooms, virus, petrified wood, and a fern. Now, the mushroom is from the kingdom fungi, and we'll discuss that in the fourth quarter of the year. They follow all the necessary requirements to be considered living. Petrified wood is a little more confusing because it was at one time alive. It did follow the necessary requirements for living. It reproduced, it grew, it metabolized, it adapted to change, and it has evolved. But in its current state, it has been fossilized and is considered a fossil. The virus, that one, many people mistaken that one for living. It is non-living. It does not have the characteristics of life. It does not metabolize. It cannot adapt to its environment. It can only reproduce with the help of a foreign organism, like a cell. And a fern, of course, is a plant, and we can all identify that as living. The next thing we're going to talk about is the organization of life from big to small. We also did this freshman year. Some of you may have even made a foldable to help learn this concept. The biological organization unfolds as following. The largest is the biosphere, and this is where all of the environments on Earth exist that support life. When we go one step smaller, we have what's called an ecosystem, and that's where all the organisms living in a particular area and the physical components with which the organisms interact. We use the term biotic and abiotic. Remember, bio means living, so these are the living organisms within that environment, and the non-living, the abiotic, things like water, sunlight, wind, soil. How do those interact with the living things within that given area? All right, so we started with the biosphere, and then we went to the ecosystem, and now we're going to go to the community. Now, the community is the entire array of organisms living in a particular ecosystem. So this is where we would have more than one species interacting. For example, we have the lemurs here interacting with the plants. And I'm sure if we could zoom in, we would probably see some insects in there as well. And then once we talk about the population now would just be the lemurs. So it's just the individuals of a species within that specific area. So getting smaller, we had a population, which is a group of lemurs, and now we just have an individual lemur. So that would be the organism. We're talking about this specific organism or individual. So we started with the biosphere, and now we have the ecosystem, which is the forest in Madagascar with our example. And then we talked about the community, which would be, again, remember the lemurs with the plants. Then we went down to just the lemurs, which is a population. And then we ended with our single lemur, that individual or an organism. And now getting smaller, so we had our organism, our individual lemur. Now, if we were to dissect that lemur into smaller parts, we would first look at the organ system, which is several organs that cooperate in a specific function. And then we could look at an organ, so that specific structure, like for instance a heart, and how it's composed of tissues, multiple types of tissues that provide a specific function for the organism. Then if we were to go even smaller to the tissue would break down to a group of similar cells that perform a specific function, and then even smaller is the cell, which is our basic fundamental unit of life. We've now gotten down to the point that we are no longer considered a living organism. So these components make up the basic living organism, which is the cell, but we're going to kind of take things down even smaller. So if we were to now dissect a cell, we would break it down into organelles. And organelles are a membrane-bound structure that performs a specific function in a cell. Although that's not completely correct, because we do have ribosomes inside of cells, which are considered organelles, but they do not have a membrane. And we'll talk about that discrepancy when we discuss the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Then we also have a molecule, which many of you should have studied in chemistry, which is a cluster of small chemical units called atoms, which are held together by chemical bonds. And you will review those chemical bonds in your next chapter. Just for a quick review, we started with the largest thing, the biosphere. Then we went to the ecosystem, and then the ecosystem down into a community. From the community to a population to organism. When we broke the organism down, we then went to our organ system, which is made up of different organs. Organs then are made up of tissues. Tissues are then made up of different cells. When we then break down the cell, we go to an organelle, from the organelle to the molecule, and eventually down to the smallest basic unit of all matter, which is an atom. Now that we've organized life from large to small, let's see how we classify or categorize life. Now, as technology improves and things are more modernized, there are different ways that we can organize life. And right now we have two main systems that we use. The first one is called the domains. Now, domains break life into three categories. So we have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And both of these are basically single-celled organisms that most of us would consider bacteria, but we'll discuss in further detail the differences between them. Now, all life that we're familiar with would be over here in eukaryota. Now, this is the system of organizing, or should I say classifying life into the Linnaean system, which uses the Latin genus species names. And this is called the kingdom system. Now, when I was in high school, there was only 5 kingdoms, but now we have broken one of them up into 2. So there are 6 kingdoms. There are eubacteria and archaebacteria. And these are the 2 that when I was your age, actually younger, were one kingdom called Monera. And you may hear me refer to the Monarans from time to time, and that's what I'm talking about, is these 2 groups, basically the bacteria. And then we also have kingdom Protista, fungi, Animalia, and Plantae, which we will spend most of 4th quarter going into quite a bit of detail over these 4 kingdoms. This slide just demonstrates the difference between the 3 domains and the 6 kingdoms. So you need to familiarize yourself with both of these methods in which biologists organize life.